No other Western democracy will ever tolerate something like this, but no other Western democracy lives 5 seconds away from those trying to annihilate them.
Like if Detroit were, firing rockets at us, we would immediately go to annihilate. And I feel like there would be widespread public support to make sure that we are defended. It's odd to me that Israel seems to be held to a higher moral standard than the West would hold to themselves, number one. And number two, to go beyond that and have sympathy for those who are coming from an extremely hateful ideology.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Off the Record. This is a space where we aim to restore nuanced conversations about Israel and the Middle East in an era dominated by misinformation and bad faith discourse. We want to create room for honest, balanced discussion where criticism, disagreement, and complexity are welcome, but anti-Semitism and dehumanization are not. I'm Zina Rachamilova, and as we record this episode, a story circulating across the media is putting many Israelis on edge. The threat of another war between Israel and Iran appears to be looming. Yesterday, footage spread widely on social media of what appears to be members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, conducting missile drills. Israeli officials warned the Trump administration over the weekend that these exercises could be preparations for a strike against Israel. Israeli sources have expressed concern because while missile movements and drills in Iran are not on their own unusual, the IDF's risk tolerance is far lower than what it once was after 2 years of war following the October 7th attacks. Just 6 weeks ago, Israeli intelligence raised similar alarms after identifying Iranian missile movements, though nothing ultimately came of it. Some of you remember the episode I did on the Commission of Inquiry, where we discussed how difficult it is to assess and act on intelligence based on these threats alone. After the massive security failure of October 7th, the last thing Israel can afford right now is a surprise attack by the regime in Iran. Based on what's publicly known, how imminent is an attack from Iran? Well, according to Axios, one Israeli source assesses that the likelihood of an Iranian attack is less than 50%, but no one is willing to take the risk of dismissing these developments as merely an exercise, the way that they did on October 7th. That same Axios report says that the United States does not currently have any intelligence that indicates an Iranian attack is imminent. Still, Israel appears to be concerned and are taking the IRGC missile exercises very seriously. Israel's military chief of staff, Eyal Zamir, has been urging close coordination between the U.S. and Israeli forces on defensive preparations. Now, in many ways, this resembles the Cold War, this style standoff where Israel and Iran are preparing for the possibility of an attack while trying to avoid being the side that actually preempts the attack, knowing that the consequences could be devastating. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is expected to meet U.S. President Donald Trump on December 29th, where he plans to discuss Iran's efforts to rebuild its ballistic missile capabilities and the possibility of Israel launching another strike against Iran in 2026. Israeli sources have said that by the end of the last confrontation with Iran, the regime was left with roughly 1,500 missiles, which is down from about the 3,000 that they had previously, and about 200 launchers compared to the 400 that it had before. So for now, much depends on the meeting between Trump and Netanyahu next week. Now, let's move on to another story that hasn't received as much attention. Many of you remember the intense media coverage during the food crisis in Gaza. That period, in many ways, was a disaster. Logistical failures, poor decision-making from senior officials, incompetence at the United Nations, and media manipulation, like highlighting Gazans with neurodegenerative diseases to imply that they were dying from starvation. At the same time, Israel struggled to communicate why aid wasn't reaching Gazans despite there being sufficient supplies. In August, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, better known as the IPC, declared that Gaza was experiencing a famine. But according to two mathematicians who released a letter on Sunday, that conclusion wasn't based on reality. They argue it was the result of manipulated math. Here's what they found. The IPC reportedly inflated starvation deaths by counting people killed in combat as if they had died from hunger. To classify a famine, there must be more than 200 related deaths per 10,000 people per day. Gaza never came close. At its peak, the real number of nonviolent, potentially hunger-related deaths were around 18 per day, far below the roughly 200 needed to meet that threshold. When that wasn't enough, the IPC allegedly speculated a sudden massive spike in starvation deaths, despite the actual data showing the opposite. Nonviolent deaths held steady in August and declined sharply in September and October. Put simply, while the famine was being declared, the numbers were actually going down. Now, I'm still processing this report. One of the mathematicians is apparently a Cambridge professor, and he wishes to remain anonymous, and no independent deep dive has verified these claims yet. What we do know is that there was serious hunger in Gaza. Aid distribution was a real problem, and labeling it as famine or starvation was wrong. If the numbers hold, the IPC owes the public a very clear explanation. I myself went into the Kerem Shalom side of Gaza and saw the mountains of aid that were rotting away in the sun. The UN failed to ensure reliable delivery, rejected offers of assistance from groups like the GHF or the IDF, and the world largely failed to place the responsibility where it belongs. On Hamas. Just last week, Gazans uncovered warehouses filled with expired baby formula and nutritional shakes that had been hidden from the public. Many residents accused Hamas of stockpiling the aid to manufacture a famine narrative for propaganda purposes. When the Western world ignores Hamas's actions, they allow the group to keep exploiting and terrorizing the Palestinian population. In the end, ordinary Gazans suffer, and the world is prioritizing politics over people. Now, the way that the crisis in Gaza is being reported shows how quickly social media can shape public opinion. To give us insight into this dynamic, we're joined by Judy Jo, who is joining us all the way from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Judy Jo is a Canadian content creator who focuses on commentary around internal issues in Canada. She also has a background in politics, having worked for members of parliament and has been active with the Conservative Party of Canada. Over the summer, during Israel's 12-day war with the Iranian regime, Judy witnessed social media become a hotbed of anti-Semitic propaganda and widespread misinformation. When she made a video discussing the regime and the crimes it has committed, without even mentioning Israel, her video was flooded by a mob of anti-Semites who also directed anti-Asian hatred towards her. Now, Judy's visiting Israel with a group of journalists and media professionals to take a deep dive into what's actually happening in Israel and across the broader Middle East. Thank you for being with us on Off the Record.
Pleasure to be here.
So, Judy, if I understand this correctly, this is your first ever time visiting us here in Israel.
Yes.
So, how's it been?
It's been a flood of information, so much to take in. I got the opportunity to visit the south of Israel, very much near the border of where October 7th happened, the Nova Festival site, as well as Kibbutz Nir Oz. So it's been extremely impactful as well as educational and so much to take in.
So, Judy, I want to rewind to October 7th itself, over 2 years ago now. Tell us where you were when you found out what was happening, and what was your reaction?
Well, I was on social media. I started to see some people's stories of some chaotic things happening in Israel. It was confusing. Not all of the information was available, and I was just immediately starting to try to look on the news to see what had happened, and slowly started to hear about the festival and learning more as the day went on.
And so now that you've visited Israel 2 years after the massacre, what has stood out for you? What have you learned now that you think you might have not gotten the full perspective of while you were getting all the information in Canada?
During my time here, I think more than anything I've learned, and the biggest impact for me has been the resilience of the Jewish people as well as the Israeli community here. The sense of togetherness and unity in advocating for the hostages, for the defense of your nation from not just the community that live in Israel, but the diaspora who, flew back into Israel as soon as they could after October 7th. I think that sense of unity, community, and nationhood has really struck me the most.
And something, I guess, less sad, tell us about what surprised you about Israel in general, something that, that you came in here not knowing about necessarily.
Just how beautiful it is, how warm people are. Just coming from Canada and Toronto specifically, I think we've seen a bit of a decline of a sense of national identity and culture as well as patriotism. So to come to a country where people have that in abundance has been really beautiful and nostalgic to see.
Yeah, it's definitely felt like many of us who do grow up outside of the Middle East feel that in a lot of these Western nations, it's now been, we've lost this sense of community and patriotism and wanting to go above and beyond to make our country a better place. It has just felt like it's become a hotbed of polarization and identity politics, and we've just lost that sense of community, I would say. Yeah. So I agree with you. And I think that's something in Israel, despite our internal politics that we have here, that we still have that sense of patriotism here, no matter where you fall on the political spectrum. Now, you came here with a group of journalists and media professionals. I guess I'm curious as to what you feel like the overall experience and reactions were to something like this, because this isn't regular in Canada, many of the things that you guys have seen and been exposed to. So what has stood out for you guys as media professionals?
I can say that from the Western perspective, there comes a latent suspicion about Israel because of all of the propaganda and variety of perspectives that are presented in Canadian media. Israel itself has become a trigger word, a very contentious word. And so naturally, those who are coming from Canada are curious to see those accusations and questions addressed for themselves. So a lot of the questions that surround, the speakers or the sites that we've been to, I can see it sort of layered with in the background of, I have to have an answer for the opponents that I speak to, or I have to get this question answered for myself.
So you think because of such propaganda that it's very difficult for even journalists that are visiting here to be able to, they feel like they need to see both sides and there isn't some sort of right versus wrong moral clarity that exists in media professionals nowadays?
Yeah, I think that media professionals, even media professionals, are operating within the context of a lot of misinformation and people who are saying different opinions, especially recently, even from traditionally right-wing voices in media. So there is a little lack of clarity on what is the truth and what's the correct unbiased take to have. And is being pro-Israel even something that is morally correct or factually correct? There's a lot of missing pieces in from the Western perspective there.
Well, that's really scary and unnerving to hear. I guess I want to understand where your own, experiences and moral clarity come to, because obviously this is a very complicated and nuanced conflict. There is so much history, there's so much baggage and so much trauma that both sides have received. But I'm curious to know, from my perspective as a journalist, is that I just feel that democracies will always struggle against non-state terror entities, that as Israel can do everything right, but it will always struggle because it has the upper hand, and people just simply don't like when Jews have the upper hand and when they can defend themselves with guns. And it just feels that if this had happened anywhere else, the level of depravity that happened on October 7th, and the fact that we were hit with multiple different fronts from Hezbollah, from the Houthis, from all of these other proxy terror groups by the Iranian regime, that no other Western democracy will ever tolerate something like this, but no other Western democracy lives 5 seconds away from those trying to annihilate them. So I want to understand I know that was such a long-winded question, but I'm curious to understand your personal opinion with everything, and then where you think the Western, especially Western media professionals, are struggling to grasp these concepts.
Yeah, that's definitely a factor. I think the West is so geographically cocooned from being terrorized or having the threat of terror right at our borders. But I constantly think, and I make the analogy that, if coming from Toronto, let's say, like if Detroit were firing rockets at us, we would immediately go to annihilate. And I feel like there would be widespread public support to make sure that we are defended in whatever way possible. So it's odd to me that Israel seems to be held to a higher moral standard than the West would hold to themselves, number one. And number two, to go beyond that and have sympathy for those who are coming from an extremely hateful ideology. So another thing that the West doesn't understand is the ideology of these groups that Israel is having to contend with, whether it's Hamas, whether it's Hezbollah, whether it's the other countries that are surrounding them, like Iran, that are wanting the annihilation of Israel and frankly also of the West. So because of those kind of ignorances, as well as a lot of years of propaganda in the West about how the West should hate themselves, they should constantly be apologetic for their own existence, and how race and identity politics should determine all of your views, have conglomerated to today's, natural support almost of terrorist groups and sympathizing with those who, to the West are painted as the marginalized, oppressed, colored group.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. And, to draw on that, you're Canadian, I'm Canadian. I've now been living here for many, many years. And I feel like every time I go back to my hometown in Toronto, I don't recognize it. I do not recognize what used to be my home.
Neither do we.
Right. And forget that I'm not even speaking about the demographics. I'm talking about how it feels like Canada has deteriorated so significantly. The housing market. So everywhere there's all of these crises happening, but Canada specifically, I just feel like every time I go back, it feels like a defeated country. And even more so where we see this within the Jewish community, the rhetoric that exists within Jewish communities now about like, oh, well, we're waiting for something like what happened in Australia to now happen in Canada. It's only a matter of time. Like I would have never said something like that when I was living there. So the thought that this has now just become second nature, they say that when a society starts targeting the Jews in this manner, that it's the very first sign of a crumbling society. And so what's going on in Canada? What's happening?
Yeah. Where to begin when it comes to Canada in the last 10 to 15 years? It is a crumbling society, in my opinion. And worse than that, and worse than the facts that you mentioned, like the economy, the housing, and the demographics and infrastructure, one of the most concerning things to me is the mentality of Canadians and the lack of willingness to stand up for their own values and their own people. I go into this a little bit in my own personal social media and campaigned very heavily during our last federal election cycle. But essentially there is a generational divide, there is a gap of understanding, and there's simply also a lack of national unity, a national identity, a sense of what do we stand for. And our leadership has been of no help. The government of Canada has recognized, I think, the state of Palestine recently. These are catering to fringe marginal groups, in my opinion, that are not in the interests of Canadian values or society. There's so much I can say about it, but I do think Canada is a crumbling society, unfortunately. And I do think that one of the biggest things is that even me saying that would be considered contentious and radical.
So what can be done?
What can be done? I do think that Canada is due for a change in leadership on maybe multiple levels of government. I think catering to marginal groups is wrong, and I think we should draw a line at some point and say you cannot continue to have pro-terrorist demonstrations on the streets and be protected for it. I think that those who are standing for Canadian values and values of freedom and liberty should be encouraged. And frankly, that has to be grassroots as well as from political leadership as well.
Do you see very clearly the anti-Semitism that is driven behind these protests?
It's veiled, but that is the new wave or new form now, right? You can't say I'm anti-Jewish, but you can certainly say I'm anti-Zionist. But somehow the two seem to be inextricably linked together every single time. So when you see a Jewish person or somebody that were to say, identify themselves as Jewish, why are pro-Palestine demonstrators standing outside of a shul? Why are pro-Palestine demonstrators going into Jewish neighborhoods? If anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are not linked, then how come they are the ones that are linking it?
Yeah.
It seems that it's raining and you're asking me to say that it's not.
Yeah. And, we had a guest recently who comes from the American conservative Christian right, where we talked about now this divide that's happening within mainstream Christian and conservative circles, because we generally thought that, the issue of Israel, and I know this is more relevant to the U.S., but like the American-Israel relationship was always ironclad under a Republican administration or under Christian allies. And there seems to be a targeted campaign to create discord within communities that have always been notoriously pro-Israel, or individuals who understood why there needs to be a strong Israel, because it is the first line of defense in an area that wants to destroy the West. So what are your comments on that as someone that I think does come from that community as well?
Yeah, I certainly do. I mean, I consider myself a conservative and a Christian, and I'm also seeing what's happening within the media and within the American right-wing political discourse. I'll just say that without sounding conspiratorial, it's odd to me that these formerly traditional or pillar right-wing voices have decided one day to change their tune, and one day change their tune very specifically and speak frequently about being anti-Israel. Another thing that concerns me is the tie-in of Christianity to this sentiment, that somehow, there seems to be a specific campaign to say that if you're a Christian, you don't have to support Israel. While that's still true, technically, you don't have to do anything, right? It's odd to me. It seems like a concerted campaign, and it seemed to have started at a certain point in time and continuing. So that, personally, I would start to question what is motivating these people to say these things, and I'm calling out Tucker Carlson, I'm calling out Candace Owens. And as a Christian as well, I don't see certain things that I would consider to be Christian coming from these people. So I'm highly suspicious.
Interesting. Well, I mean, we have talked about a lot of heavy things. I want to end this off quickly by just, I know you mentioned that it was very inspiring to see the unity and the strong ties that the people have with one another. But I think this isn't just a Jewish problem. This is they always say they come for the Saturday people first, and then they go for the Sunday people. Mm-hmm. And so I think we're all on the same team, and we all really want to make sure that our values, our Judeo-Christian values, are preserved in a time when many people want to destroy them. Mm-hmm. And so I want you to try to end on a positive note, whether that's tying into maybe something that you take away from here, something that you hope for humanity in the future. And, let's try to leave it off with a positive note.
Okay. My hope is that, let's take a step back. If you can just divide society into two and say there's one side that promotes life, liberty, and the sanctity of a human life, and there's another side that doesn't, I think it's clear which side you should side with. I also want to address, there's some isolationist talk, right? Like, this isn't our war. We don't want to get involved in other wars. That's simply not the reality that we live in today. We live in a globally interconnected world. And even as an individual, what happens across, on the other side of the world impacts you individually as well. And I think my hope is that we can move forward to recognize that and to build stronger allies, and hopefully that within great darkness, there can also be great light. And my hope is that great light, emerges in unity and in support and in the human resilience.
Amazing. Judy Jo, thank you so much for joining us today on Off the Record. Everyone should follow Judy Jo on her social media, on her Instagram and her TikTok. And thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your visit in Israel.
Thank you for having me.
That's it for today's episode of Off the Record. Thanks for joining us as we dug into the news, unpacked the facts, and explored the stories beyond the headlines. I'm Zina Rachamilova. Stay curious, stay informed, and we'll see you next time.